And this is video 3.8. To what extent did the people of India benefit from these policies? So we've looking at the policies and let's see if they worked. Kind of. The economic and social policies of India resulted in substantial improvements, including life expectancy has gotten much better since the 50s. The life expectancy back then was 32 years, now it's up to 63 years. Literacy rate has improved quite a bit, from 16% up to 62%. And infant mortality rate has gotten a lot better too. 146 deaths out of 1,000 compared to 71 out of 1,000. So we've seen some improvements overall. Let's break it down. Unemployment and regional inequality. 5-year plans helped unemployment, but they didn't solve the problem absolutely. We saw increase in agriculture, we saw increases in industrial production. However, millions of landless peasants and homeless people are in the slums of all the big cities. And so you've got a stronger economy, but there's still a lot of homeless people and still a lot of people without jobs. When it comes to regional inequality, there are vast differences between the different states and different cities. The richer areas like Bombay and Punjab versus some of the poorer areas are just not doing well, and you can see the differences. The plans to help included land reform and rural development projects, and they helped a little, but they got a long ways to go. For example, there's a large difference in the rate of literacy for girls in wealthy Kerala versus poor Rajasthan. In the 1990s, less than 80% of girls had never been to school in Rajasthan. And so we're seeing large differences just between two states right next to each other. Speaking of which, education. There were major advances in education, but they just couldn't keep up with the growing population. So they'd make these reforms, and those reforms would be great, but they just kept getting more and more people, and the system just couldn't handle it. By the mid-60s, only 61% of children were actually attending primary school, and that's only 43% girls. The large cities had schools, but some rural areas lacked any school at all, or they had very high dropout rates, or the schools were just they were in very poor shape because they would lack the facilities. They didn't have the proper buildings. They lacked the equipment to have a nice school. 40% of these rural schools only had one teacher for all the different age groups, so one teacher for several different grades. The literacy rate had only risen up to 24% from 16 by Nehru's death in 1964, so it only rose just a bit. Critics believe that Nehru's reforms did increase attendance in school, but they needed larger, bigger reforms to the entire education system for a significant change. And so education failed to raise the status of a majority of the population, especially the urban poor and in the rural areas. The position of minorities and the castes. The Constitution guarantees equality, and programs were put in place to raise the status of the Dalit, of the untouchables. And so they were guaranteed this by law. However, in reality, just not much happened. There was no sustained campaign against the caste system, and they didn't really keep up these promises. New laws were passed, but they didn't really abolish the social disadvantages and the discrimination against the Dalit. And so caste oppression is still very common in rural areas today, even in some of the cities. We see acts of violence against the Dalit continue, and some of these attacks occur because of this perceived preferential treatment because of government policies trying to raise them up. And so they are still limited to some of the worst jobs. For example, a lot of the jobs working in the sewer system, like the picture up top, are specifically for Dalit. It's some of the only jobs they can get. The picture right over here is of a boss paying his Dalit workers, but he doesn't actually want to touch them. So what he does is he actually wraps the money in paper and passes it on to him so he can remain pure. And so we still have this social stigma where the different castes are just not quite getting along. And so the government has a lot more work to do on this. Position of women, government has a lot more work to do on this. The legal position of women advanced legally with the Hindu Marriage Act and the Hindu Succession Act. However, they couldn't just change these attitudes easily. Especially in the rural areas, it's going to be harder to change minds than it is the law. And so a lot of these rural women were reluctant to claim their rights of inheritance just because of tradition where they don't get anything. All of a sudden they have this right, and if they stood up, they're seen as being different, even though it's perfectly legal. The dowry system continues to this day, despite it being outlawed. It's just become a strong cultural practice. We have seen, on the upside, we have seen significant increases in the number of girls in school. This is mostly in urban areas, however. The rural areas are still lagging behind significantly. After Nehru, in 1964, women's rights groups started to take up issues of violence against women. And one of the nastier ones is dowry deaths, where women are tortured or murdered and when their husbands demand greater dowries from their families. So it's extortion. It's give me more money for marrying this woman or else. And so on the side here, you can see a little chart on the issues, and it's actually part of the Indian law that when a married woman dies, within 7 years of marriage, it's going to be pretty suspicious. And so sometime we'll see due to hanging, and often the woman is pushed towards suicide, burnt alive, bodily injury, or unnatural causes. And soon before death, she was harassed for dowry by the husband or his relatives. And then these people are presumed to have caused the dowry death, and punishment is a minimum of 7 years, which can be extended to life in prison. And so it's this nasty system that's just led to a series of extortion. And we've started to push for about changing attitudes about rape, as well as they've got issues of declining populations of females, where there are more men than women because of this, that it's preferred to have men, and the issues of the cost of having a daughter when it comes to dowry, even though the dowry is illegal. The declining population of females is due to a couple reasons. One is female infanticide, in that the parents are killing their daughters at it. And so we're seeing a 10% higher death rate for girls than boys. And so something's fishy there, and that likely they're being murdered. Abortions for female babies are also more likely, so then when they find the gender during a sonogram test, they're more likely to abort if it's a female child, because they want to avoid a lot of these other issues. And they want to avoid the cost, and there's also this preferential treatment for boys. Distribution of wealth. Improvements from economic and social policies were often offset, again, by these high population growth rates. They got to really get a handle on this. They made efforts at land reform and rural development, but really they had limited success in reducing poverty for millions of landless villagers. So it helped a little bit, but then they just kept getting more and more people. On the upside, despite all this pressure, they have maintained a democratic government. They've had no great revolution, and they haven't had to go into extreme circumstances. So it's unlike the Soviet Union or China, whose governments had to use force and had to go to certain extremes with their 5-year plans to battle poverty. And so this is kind of taking a look at their population growth. Again, as I mentioned, more men than women. 1.21 billion as of 2011, so there are probably more, way more now. But if you add up the USA, Indonesia, Brazil, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Japan, that's about equal to where India is. And this is showing the population growth over time. And again, they're growing by leaps and bounds. Literacy has improved, and this is showing the sex ratio, the gender ratio, and population density. So they're getting more crowded, and they're not getting more land, just more people. Problem is they're not getting more jobs as well, so they have issues there. So that was just an overall look at kind of the results of these programs. This next quick little bit is going to take a look at the culture and some of the fun and the cultural impact of their democracy. And so some of the things as you wander around India, and that you'll see Indian culture combines modern and traditional. And so you can see the more ancient stuff, but India is not limited to just the ancient stuff, just the Taj Mahal. It's more than that. It is a modern democracy. And so Chandigarh was built as the new capital of the Punjab state in India because the old capital went to Lahore, went to Pakistan in partition. So they had to build a new capital, and so they decided to go modern. And so they hired a French architect, Le Corbusier, And they built this modern city. So you can see some examples of this modern architecture where it's got some Indian flavor, but they're going for a more modern city. And so there's this open hand statue and some of the government buildings inside and out where they're going for a more metropolitan and more modern feel. Bollywood, definitely a strong part of Indian culture. This is the film industry based in the city of Bombay or Mumbai. This is the largest film producing nation on the planet. 25% of all movies but currently made, are from India. And they include a wide variety, but it is a lot of movies. The quality varies, but they're producing a whole lot of it. And so you see commercial films available to a large audience, so lots of little romances. You'll see nationalist films including messages of putting your country first and patriotism, but also stressing the importance of tolerance and coexistence. So it's not all just hoorah, yay India. It's also about we have to work together because we have such variety in our nation. Some films will explore the challenges of modern life, including the rural poor. So if you look at something like Slumdog Millionaire as an example of the difficulties of modern life. Other art forms often will include mixes. So they'll maybe be borrowed from the West, but you'll mix in this unique Indian style to create something new. They have one of the largest television networks in the world because, again, so many movies. And then as the literacy rate has increased, so has the amount of people reading newspapers. And so newspapers have increased dramatically. Freedom of the press is not in the Constitution. However, freedom of speech and expression is in the Constitution. And it has gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and they have stated that freedom of the press is included under freedom of speech. That's their interpretation. However, reasonable censorship in times of emergency is allowed if in the public interest. And so there are certainly limits of how far they can go when it comes to the freedom of the press. All right. And so that was a little look at culture and the results and impact of democracy in India.